welcome to A House Divided. I'm Daniel Weinberg, and as always, we're here at the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago in our international broadcast studio. So we hope you're watching anywhere that you are. But at the same time, we're lucky to be an internet show and not an in-house, in-shop book signing, primarily at least. Because since our nation is in shutdown mode, you can't come here anyway. So we come to you. Here we are. We're happy that our author is also willing to travel to Chicago on this March 14th, 2020. So sit back in your self-quarantine and enjoy this interview. We hope, by the way, that you will also be a part of it. If you have any questions during this next hour, please push the button just below the screen and send in a question to us. We'll look right in the camera and answer it for you. Give us your name and where you're from so we can give a shout out as well. If the set looks a little different today, we're a little bit further away from each other. That's because we're following best practices, okay? So don't forget again with your questions, please do that. So we're very happy to have Megan Kate Nelson come in here today. She's a writer and historian of the Civil War, U.S. Western history, and American culture. She got her PhD at the University of Iowa in American Studies. She writes for the New York Times, the Washington Post, Smithsonian Magazine, Preservation Magazine, and our favorite, the Civil War Monitor. She's the author of Ruined Nation and Trembling Earth. And unlike many other historians that we have on our broadcast, she knows how to use social media. Thank you. We're happy about that. We're here with her latest book, The Three-Cornered War, the Union, the Confederacy, and Native Peoples in the Fight for the West. It's a Scribner publication. We appreciate them for sending her to us. It's 331 pages, illustrated, and with excellent maps, and is $28. So this is your chance to get a signed copy if you want. Just let us know. You can get a copy and order it while you're listening to the show. Now, I'm not sure I've said this before to many, if any, books, but reading this, as I got toward the end, I started to slow down. I didn't want it to end. So as we were talking before the show, you were talking about how you had really been in a studies of both history and literature. And it shows in this book. So very happy with that. Now in your acknowledgments, it's not often that a coffee shop gets acknowledged so profusely, and I presume it was essential to the existence of this book. Yes?
Yes.
Want to give a shout out to them?
In fact, yes. So a shout out to Haute Coffee in Concord, Massachusetts, and also to Saltbox Kitchen in West Concord, where I wrote a considerable amount of this book. Since I write full-time, I have a home office, and I often write there or I write at my kitchen island, but sometimes I like to actually get out of the house. It's good for me to actually leave, and those places were really fantastic. I find that I really write and focus well in cafes, which is not that's not the same for a lot of people, but I really liked it, and they will bring you caffeine and tasty snacks. So
listen,
thank you.
In your acknowledgments as well, you write that you wanted to write history differently. How and in what way?
Yes. So when I was thinking about the Civil War West and how broad and complicated the history of it was, and how many communities were involved, I was thinking that I needed to write this book in a different way than I had written my previous books. Both Trembling Earth and Ruined Nation are pretty, kind of standard academic texts, very argument-driven, thematic, and sometimes chronological chapters. But I really thought that this book and the story I wanted to tell with it demanded a different kind of approach. And as you noted before, I was a history and literature major undergraduate and an American Studies PhD. So I read a lot of novels. I also, watch a lot of TV. I pay attention to narrative in different forms. And during the time that I was thinking about how I was going to write this book, I had been reading a lot of novels that had this tactic of multi-perspective narrative, where you start with one person and then you move to a different person and you see the same events from different perspectives. And it creates for the reader, I think, a really nice sense of tension and also a nice sense of the fullness of this moment and the kinds of things that the protagonists are experiencing. And so I thought I would experiment with that. So The Three-Cornered War has 9 protagonists. That's how many different communities were
many
involved.
of the chapters are headed their names. And
Yes.
sometimes the same chapter, 2, 3 chapters, has the same name.
Yes.
And it works. It certainly worked for me that
Oh, good.
it brings those people through. You listen to their narrative, and it's not just this battle, this
Right.
skirmish, this event.
Right.
It was the people that go through, and that's what history is about.
Yeah,
People.
exactly. Yes, and I think people who are interested in history, they want to know the kind of big moments, and they like thinking about big ideas, but they also like to read about actual people on the ground. And so it was important to me that I put the reader on the ground with all 9 of these people. And you're exactly right. When you look at the table of contents for The Three-Cornered War, it looks very different from a usual history book. And there are only 3 chapters that are not named for people, and those are named for battles. It's Valverde and Glorieta and Seilly, which is Canyon de Chelly. And in those chapters, readers see those battles from multiple perspectives. So there are multiple people involved, and so you kind of get pulled into those battles, again, on the ground with multiple protagonists. And
Yeah,
so
I started to root for people or not root
Yes.
for people.
Yeah.
I found myself doing that. Now, the bibliography and primary sources is pretty extensive and wide-ranging. What is, as if this is a priori, but I'm going to ask it anyway, what is the import of primary sources, correspondence, memoirs? How do we judge their veracity, in fact?
Right. Yeah, this is always a challenge for historians. I think you go into historical research, into primary documents, knowing that these were people who created them, right? So in the same way that we write Instagram posts or Facebook announcements or tweet, we are shaping those narratives about ourselves and about the events around us, just in the same way that people during the Civil War did. And so I think if we consider that, then we can say, okay, I know that this person has a point of view, has bias in some sort of way, very likely went back and edited, especially if it's if it's not a letter. I've seen a lot of diaries, as I'm sure you have too, where it's kind of scribbled over or rewritten so that very clearly the author has gone back and made some changes. And as long as you recognize...
That's been leveled at the Gettysburg Address, by the
Oh.
way, but go ahead.
Yes. But I think if you realize that and you take that into account, you can still use those sources in a meaningful way. But I really like, you'll also see in the acknowledgments, I went to a lot of archives and libraries throughout the Southwest and a lot of historic sites because it was important for me to be there, but also because they have a lot of local records. And it's really great to see those documents in person because even if there's transcribed documents, a lot of things don't make it in. A lot of times all the transcribers skip certain things or they get a word wrong or, for example, the John Clark record. So John Clark is one of the 9 protagonists and he's the Surveyor General of New Mexico Territory and he is probably the person readers of the book will have never heard of.
Right, there are a number of them like that. That's what's so
Yes.
interesting. Of course, the whole area is
Yes.
something, okay, Glorieta passed, yeah, I remember that, but the
Yeah.
rest of it, we don't know the people, and that's
Exactly.
why
Yeah.
this is so valuable.
And Clark was in New Mexico. He took some furloughs and some time away, but he was in New Mexico between 1861 and 1868, so the perfect time frame. And he kept these meticulous diaries. And the Fray Angelico Chavez Library in Santa Fe has all of his volumes. There are 27 volumes. But I read some of them, in person. They also were transcribed. But what was important for me to see is that he made little sketches. Because he was a surveyor. He wasn't a great artist, I have to say, but he was a map maker. He paid attention to landscape. And so within all of these leaves of the diaries are sketches of mountains, are plat maps of Santa Fe, just little sketches of other things, and that is the kind of material that you can't get unless you see the document
This
yourself.
is going to be a problem, I think, in the future, that we are all relying now on digital copies of everything.
Yes.
I mean, it's great. You don't have to go everywhere when you don't have the money or
Right.
the time.
And especially now.
And especially now,
In our
you
moment.
can still do
Yeah.
your research, but you lose so much by
You
not
do.
handling it.
Right.
And that's going to be a problem, I think, in the future. Things are going to be lost. And I've already know about some of that. I'm not going to get into that right now. But now, Clark also knew Abraham Lincoln. He came out of Illinois.
Yes.
Does Lincoln creep into these memoirs of his?
He does, actually. So Clark was appointed by Lincoln. So part of the collection of his papers in Santa Fe is his actual signed appointment as Surveyor General, so signed by Lincoln himself. So you should probably go see that.
Oh,
I
that
think
would
you
make a great
you
cover
would love
on
that.
my,
I know.
on my catalog.
I
Okay.
know, you would love that. And he knew him from lawyering. They also had kind of similar backgrounds as surveyors and lawyers. And he was a Republican. And so he was appointed Surveyor General, and he was one of hundreds of men who Lincoln appointed during the first couple of months of his presidency. And part of the reason that he was interested in doing that is not just because, this is what presidents do. They appoint officials in the normal course. But he really wanted to shore up Republican power, specifically in the West, in the states and territories there.
So he was, this is a question I was going to ask later, but here we are, that he was interested. Did he keep track of what was going on in the Southwest? And in your book, was he keeping track of this? And was Jefferson Davis doing the same?
I mean, I think that they were receiving reports, the War Departments of both the Union and the Confederacy were receiving reports from the commanders on the ground and passing along that information to Davis and Lincoln respectively in cabinet meetings. Lincoln, I think, along with the rest of his administration and most Republicans, was very interested in keeping control of the West. And one of the interesting things that happens that we haven't really paid enough attention to as Civil War historians is that once spoiler alert, the Union pushes the Confederates back to Texas in the summer of 1862 and really defeats them at Glorieta Pass by destroying their wagon train in late March. And once word of that had reached Washington, D.C., it took a little while because there were no telegraph lines, so that news had to travel on stage. Via stage for the first part
railroad
of
there
that.
yet either.
Yeah, no railroads. So once they received that news and they knew that the Union had pretty much secured the West and the Confederates were probably not going to come back, they started passing legislation that we're familiar with, but we often don't connect with the Civil War. The Homestead Act, the Pacific Railway Act. They created the Department of Agriculture.
And they kept those back for a while until the Confederates were pushed out.
Yes.
And then they put that in. So it seems that both sides, being American, each side, the South as well, had a manifest destiny in their minds. So both of them were looking to the West to push toward California. Is that correct?
Yes, yes. And the Confederates in particular, gaining control over the West would have been extremely helpful for them in the war effort if they had succeeded. They wanted access, particularly to California, but also the larger West. They wanted the gold from its mines to help fund the war effort. They wanted Pacific ports, which became very important even early in the war when the blockade was starting and was actually starting to have an effect, because they wanted to ship that cotton out. And if they could gain control of California and gain a foothold in the West, not only would they have those deep water ports, particularly in Southern California, but pretty much all along the West Coast, but they also would have access to Mexico, and they thought they could also take cotton out through those ports. And that was a huge concern for them. That was very helpful, because it takes a lot of money to finance the war. And so they thought gold and cotton would do it for them. And the West was a very important part of that vision. And then they also had this kind of vision of the future. And I think Civil War historians don't talk about this really as much either. I mean, Anne Sarah Rubin had a great book about Confederate nationalism, and historians since then haven't really talked as much about the kind of ideologies that are motivating either the Confederates or the Union during this moment. But what were their visions of the future? And for the Confederates, I think they were thinking beyond defeating the Union. And so part of that vision was, we're going to expand the Confederacy from coast to coast, and then we're going to move south.
Well, they knew they were losing power as well. They had to gain power somewhere.
Yes.
Cuba was off limits at that point, and they had to do that, and that's what the no nationalization of slavery meant to them. Why I think they went to war in the first place, because Lincoln stopped that movement for them to go west.
Yeah, I mean, because this is something. At the very beginning of the project, I was just befuddled because we talk all the time about the significance of the Western territories in the run-up to the Civil War.
And
then it's like there's the firing on Fort Sumter, and then suddenly we think that Americans just stopped thinking about the West entirely and only focused on the East. And it is true, obviously, the Western theater did not command huge headlines in the East. Easterners were very much focused on the Eastern War, and I don't argue in this book, and I've never argued anywhere else, that this far Western theater was more important or was dominating headlines, over Eastern theater operations, but it did continue to be a concern. I mean, it's 40% of the nation's landmass, and there was reason for the Union to be worried about retaining it, because there were a lot of communities in the West that had very good reason to go with the Confederacy and not with the Union.
I'm going to get to that in a second. I want to go back to something before I forget it, and go to primary sources.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And of course, there's Alonzo Ickey's diary, which seemed to have been, well, I hope very informative. It's certainly a vivid writer as well, yes? But what are the Native American side? How did you find primary sources for their side?
So with Native sources, I was using...
This is, by the way, side. This is a triangle. We're talking about South, North, and
Native peoples. Yes, the three
So
corners.
let's take the Native.
Yes,
How
absolutely.
did we get them? Because everyone else wrote memoirs after.
Right. So Native peoples enter records in all kinds of different ways. So in terms of tracking, there's Mangus Coloradus, who is Chiricahua Apache, and he is one of the protagonists to bring readers into that world and into Chiricahua Apache concerns and actions during this period. And then Juanita is a Navajo woman who is articulating all of those experiences of her people in New Mexico during this time period. So one of the ways I was able to track both of them was actually through U.S. military records, because military commanders were very concerned about Mangus Coloradus and the Chiricahuas, so he pops up everywhere. And then also, Juanita was married to Manuelito, who was also a real target, especially for James Carleton, who comes in later in September of 1862. So I was able to track her movements through him in many ways. So that's one way to achieve it. Another way is, and a really important way, is through indigenous sources themselves. So oral histories, particularly for the Navajo experience of the Long Walk and Bosque Redondo. The Navajo people have collected a great number of oral histories and documentation of both of those experiences.
Were they doing that themselves, or were these Anglos coming in and doing this?
No, they were collecting themselves, and then, luckily for us, they have published those accounts. And so I was able to access them, and they were willing to share them with people outside the Navajo community. And I also went to the Navajo Nation Museum in Arizona, and they have a really large collection of material objects. And one of the most important elements of Navajo society in this moment were blankets and other forms of textiles. And they had a lot of examples of those with dates on them, so I could see the sorts of designs. And Juanita was a very accomplished weaver. And so this was a way for me to both access her experience and her power within the Navajo community, because women who wove, really created these items that then circulated around the Southwest and that were a linchpin in the Navajo economy and in their relationships both with Hispanos in New Mexico and also Anglos. So seeing that material culture enabled me to access both Navajo culture and their experience during the 1860s in a different sort of way. So it's really, I mean, when you're trying to build a story like this where there aren't traditional sources, or there may be some traditional sources but not everything, this is where actually my experience as an American Studies person comes in very handy, because I do not hesitate to use all different kinds of material objects, visual sources, the landscape itself, in addition to the kinds of primary documents we usually use.
Yeah, we're going to get to that too.
Yeah.
But I want to go back to something you talked about before very quickly, that, well, the northern part of the territory was more Union. Mm-hmm. The southern part of the territory was more secessionist-minded, as, you know, it's kind of went right across the nation in a way. But was there a brothers versus brothers war out there at all, like was in Kansas and elsewhere, where really, or other border states where they really, you know, the next door neighbor could be someone different than you?
Right.
Was there much of that? And where did the Anglos come from the east?
Right.
What percentage you think was what from the south, the north? Where did they come from? And were they after each other leading up to the war and through the part that we're talking about in this book?
Sure. So migration to the West in the 1840s, Anglo migration, happened in a couple of different streams. And so there was the northern stream that went via the Oregon Trail. And then there was another stream that came along a road that went from Mesilla, which is in southern New Mexico, along the Rio Grande, all the way to Los Angeles. And along that southern route, a lot of Southerners were coming, sort of directly from Texas, a lot from Kentucky, places in the border south, and coming fully west along that southern route. And so this is why there's a pretty heavily secessionist population in Mesilla, also in Tucson, and also in kind of the Los Angeles, San Bernardino area. And so there are a lot of miners who are Southerners, who are secessionists in those locations, and in kind of sprinkled around mining towns throughout the West. But that, and there were also some who moved all the way up who became merchants and traders. So if you were talking about the kind of brothers' war or sort of a neighbors' war, there were a group of very prominent Santa Fe Anglos who, when the war broke out and when military commanders started to resign to join the Confederacy, they also moved south to muster into the Confederate Army, and they came back. And the most famous group of this was called the Brigands. And they were attached to Sibley's brigade. And they were actually the first people to enter Santa Fe in early March and to take and occupy it for the Confederacy. So they cut down the flagpole and built a new one and erected the state of Texas flag, basically, but also the Confederate flag in order to claim that town. And so there were a lot of Unionist Santa Fe residents who were really angry about that because these were people they knew. These were people who were in their community, and they had not only, sort of abandoned Santa Fe to go join the Confederacy, but then they came back. Yeah. and took it. So there were elements of that, but there were very strong secessionist areas, mostly in that, as you're saying, in that kind of southern swath from the Rio Grande to the Colorado River.
Let's talk about terrain and weather, as you brought up. What part did terrain and weather play in the West? Certainly those grim and dangerous passes common in New Mexico, as you write. That is true. We know that from Geronimo, and knowing about the Apache especially, we know of those gullies. But tell us about the terrain overall and the importance of Apache Pass.
Yes. So I'm an environmental...
And water.
And water, yes. I am...
And then I'm going to go to lunch and you can keep going.
And then I could keep talking.
Please.
It's going to make me very thirsty while I'm talking about this. But so, as readers of my previous books will know, I am an environmental historian. I'm really interested in landscapes. I'm interested in how nature plays a role in the way that people act around each other, what they do, how they fight battles. And what's really interesting about this theater of the war is I think that you see the way that topography and hydrology, the way that climate and weather really shape the way armies act in the field. Because what you have is a Sibley's brigade, which is mustering in San Antonio, and then marching 600 miles to El Paso, and then another 400 miles north to Santa Fe. And when they do that, they're moving from a pretty humid, very low, pretty fertile area, and they're moving up in elevation. The air is getting extremely arid, and this is affecting them in all sorts of interesting ways. Some of the soldiers who were with Sibley talked about not being able to sleep because they were having headaches. And if you've ever been to high elevation locations, you know that when you first get there, you have a response to the elevation that does exactly that. You get dehydrated, you get headaches, it becomes more difficult to sleep, and this affected their readiness in the field. Also, they were moving across just huge landscapes, hundreds of miles, and they really only had water sources maybe every 40 to 50 miles. And so if they got bogged down or delayed, they could go for 2 days without water, which you would never want to do in a high desert situation. And on the flip side, the Union Army not only was made up of people who were already acclimated, who lived in these high elevation zones already, and also miners who are actually coming down from about 10,000 feet of elevation. So they're actually experiencing that sort of elevation training that we hear people talk about with athletes, where they actually have more oxygen in their blood when they get to the battlefield of Valverde than they would have had before. And so they're just in better fighting shape. But that is strange because then they end up losing that battle. So it doesn't actually help them. But one of the major takeaways I want people to have with this book is that the Far Western Theater really shows us how the high desert is just a terrible place to have large armies fighting wars. And these aren't even large armies compared to the Eastern Theater. However, they are the largest fighting forces who have ever operated in that region.
What are the quick numbers?
So the quick numbers were about 3,000 on the Confederate side and about 4,000 to 4,300 on the Union side. That was total numbers. It wasn't active engaged at any given moment because there was a lot of sickness and people falling by the wayside.
These are all brought in
or deserting.
from more east. They weren't Anglos from there, especially except for some from Santa Fe. But
Right.
many of them were new soldiers coming out for the first time.
Oh, absolutely.
Both sides.
All the Texans were pretty much new soldiers. There were some people with a little bit of experience, but most of them not seasoned military personnel. On the Union side, what's interesting about that army is how mixed it was. So there were Army regulars, men who had been posted out in those forts in New Mexico territory before the war began. So ERS Canby, who people know him as Edward Canby in the book. His family actually called him Richard. So I refer to him as Richard the entire time, which may seem to some people who are versed in military history as completely strange, but there are reasons for that I explain in the book. But he brings Canby, one of his first acts is to bring all of those soldiers in from, they abandon all of these forts in west, kind of what we now know of as Arizona, brings them into the Rio Grande and concentrates them at Fort Craig. So there are Army regulars there with a lot of officers. There are Hispano volunteers and militia who, despite the fact that Henry Sibley believed that the Hispanos would come with the Confederacy because they had fairly good reasons to perhaps resist the federal government, the vast majority of them, though, went with the Union. And so they signed up to defend their homelands. They also had a very deep-seated hatred of Texans. So the fact that the Confederate Army was entirely made up of Texans made a difference in that regard. There were also all these gold miners from Colorado Territory who were from all over the place, but mostly the Midwest. So Alonzo Ickes is from Iowa. He, had been working on an Iowa farm and had gotten west with the 1858-59 Colorado Gold Rush. So that's why he was particularly well placed. There were thousands of men in the mountains at that time that then signed up for the Union Army and marched south to fight the Confederates, and then Native peoples also. And then there were also Utes and Pueblos who signed up as scouts and spies for the Union Army. So one of the things that's so interesting about this theater is that Union Army defending New Mexico from the Confederates was one of what was the most diverse army to fight in the Civil War. And this was more than a year before the Emancipation Proclamation brought black soldiers into the Union Army.
The battles, I don't want to get too far into the battles because you explained it there. We have a lot of military people who like to watch this positively, and there's enough there, but there's so much of the people there, and that's what really drives this book, as we've already spoken about. But I want to start out with the first battle of July 25th of 1861, and which had John Baylor of the 2nd Texas Mounted. All these people, we'll get to some of the names. You won't be able to hear all the names, but we'll name some of the names later on, perhaps. But John Baylor is one of these. And you write that he was the first Confederate to lead a successful invasion of Union territory. Well, I happen to have this notice to mariners from January 26th, 1861, from Raphael Semmes, who was still in the Treasury Department, still in Union uniform, writing to the Lighthouse Board that from Washington that the way into Charleston Harbor had been blocked. Now, to me, there's maybe the first time that, maybe the second time I think, but the first time that I know of that there was a hostile action by the South. Beauregard then came in and made it to Fort Sumter. Isn't Beauregard the first to invade Union territory?
That is
curious.
Okay. I will agree with that. Although I will say that, so he may be the first to take and occupy a federal installation. And then there were also Texans who took federal forts. So Baylor was one of them in the summer of 1861. But what I'm talking about more is that they are invading Union territory and taking towns, which is, I think, a different sort.
Let's emphasis on a different syllable.
Yeah,
yes, I
exactly.
think you would say.
Exactly.
Either way is fun stories.
Yes, exactly. It's in a slightly different category, but I will take that. Yes.
Now, I'm going to we'll see if we have time a little later on to get into Valvore and that battle, because they're the first true battle of the West, as you say.
Yep.
But so many interesting stories. There was a hanging tongue. There was someone shooting directly into an ammunition dump, and Confederate dead buried where there was no marker. By the way, do we know where they were buried? Is there a marker there now?
Some were exhumed. I don't believe there is a marker there now. Valverde, the battlefield of Valverde is on private land. It's actually on ranch land owned by Ted Turner.
All right.
So you can visit the site, but you have to apply to the ranch manager. And to do that, you have to know who the ranch manager is.
Seems
and
like
have his email.
Stonewall Jackson's arm, the same thing. You got to go.
Yes,
private.
but so there.
You should put something up. I think you should have something go on to have him put up a marker.
I know. I mean, and I've been trying to convince people all along that we need to appeal to him to actually give that part of his land.
If you're listening.
Yes, Ted Turner, if you are listening, please donate the battlefield of Valverde to the state of New Mexico, because it is important. And it is, what is interesting about it is, and this is what's interesting about all of these sites across the Southwest, is that many of them are still there for you to go and visit. They have been saved by state agencies, by the Bureau of Land Management, by the National Park Service, and there hasn't been the sort of intensive suburbanization or kind of building over that we see in a lot of the eastern battlefields, or even some in the Trans-Mississippi. So they are still there. Some of our only extant Civil War ruins are actually in New Mexico and Arizona, which is
gorgeous
fascinating
territory.
and amazingly
Gorgeous
beautiful.
territory.
Yeah, and I realized that I didn't actually answer your Apache Pass question from last time, but Apache Pass is a place where you can go visit. It takes some doing. You have to be in southern Arizona, and you have to take one of two roads, one of which is all dirt, 8 miles, goes through an arroyo, and then you hike 1.5 miles to the site. The other road is more accessible, goes right up to the National Park Service headquarters, but they issue a warning that says the last kind of 800 meters of it is such rocky, sharp road that it actually punctures tires. So it takes some doing. You feel like you're actually really out there by yourself when you go to Apache Pass, but the whole area is preserved and has not, it's gone through natural changes that the landscape goes through after 150 years, but the imprint of the Civil War forts that were built still there, and the stage stations from the Butterfield route are still there, the wagon ruts from that road are still there. So you are able to go visit, and Apache Spring, which is the reason why the battle happens in July of 1862 between Union forces under James Carleton and Chiricahua Apaches. They're fighting over that spring because that spring is the only water source within a 60-mile radius in that part of Arizona. So water resources, as we were sort of discussing before, become a major landscape of contention and a point of contention in this theater in the way that they're not really in other theaters, because even though the water may have been compromised, at least it was fairly readily available in a lot of other theaters. But in the far west, a lot of the fights happen over natural resources.
Yeah, and they learned pretty quickly when they went out and didn't have enough Evian with them.
That's right.
That's right. Now, we know that what the Southerners and the Northerners, the Confederacy and the Union, were all about and what they thought about each other. What did the Native Americans think when these armies were coming out there and the Anglos were coming out there? What was their initial stance vis-a-vis the white men coming out?
So neither the Chiricahua Apaches nor the Navajos made any kind of alliance with either the Union or the Confederacy.
I'm going to butt in here that they also didn't make alliances, and maybe you'll talk about that, with each other.
Right.
And that was almost everywhere in the West, that the natives never could get together themselves to fight the onslaught. So the same thing was happening here.
Yeah, and they had their own issues with each other. Yeah. There were some tribes with whom they aligned sometimes, and then they would abandon those alliances in other contexts. So the picture is really complicated, and actually I don't think we know enough at all about all of the different Native communities, even in the Southwest, and then, not to mention the larger West, during this conflict, because the groups that I'm talking about, the Chiricahuas and the Navajos, had a pretty intensive relationship with the Union Army in particular, and it really changed the nature of their histories, and so that the Civil War becomes a watershed moment for their communities also. But there were other Native communities that did not even have any contact with either Union or Confederate forces. Then there are peoples like the Pimas and Maricopas who actually, they didn't technically make any alliances either, but they did provide food for a little bit for Confederates who were occupying Tucson and areas west of there, but then really for the Union Army that was coming from California under James Henry Carleton. And so every single indigenous community's experience was different and was in accordance with their own practices and their own histories. So that's really one of my other pleas, if we're going to say, Ted Turner, please give your land. My other plea would be to historians, please do work on these communities and their experiences during this period and the ways that they asserted their own sovereignty, the ways that they engaged with soldiers, but also civilians and miners who came, and so that we can have the fullest possible sense of the war in this theater.
I'm going to go back a little bit to Lincoln, and what the subject I want to get into is hard war.
Ah, yes.
And so I happen to have right now a gorgeous print, one of my favorite prints that was done in France. And Lincoln, here he is in the East Room, visiting with Native Americans. I'll try to put this up a little bit so you can see this as well. And this was in March 27th of 1863. A number came, Comanche, Sioux, and others, came to visit with Lincoln. As you can see, Lincoln is kind of small, whereas the Indians are the focus because the Europeans were very interested in Native Americans at this time, mid-19th century. And they were the prominent part in there, not Lincoln. But so I knew he'd given a talk, Lincoln. And I finally had, until this one, this is the third one I've had in my almost 50 years of doing this. And I finally went to the talk. It was given somewhat extemporaneously, I believe, because the newspapers took it down. There was no written down anywhere. The newspapers did it the next day. And there are two things that I want to especially highlight that he said in here. And one of them, he starts out and says, "The pale-faced people are numerous and prosperous because they cultivate the earth," as if the Indians wanted to be prosperous. But anyway, "and depend upon the products of the earth rather than wild game for subsistence." He goes on. "This is the chief reason of the difference, but there is another. Although we are now engaged in a great war between one another, we are not, as a race, so much disposed to fight and kill one another as our red brethren." So I guess he's forgotten the Crusades, the 100 Years' War,
Yes.
the Revolution. I mean, I could go on for pages along that line.
Yes.
So that's how Lincoln, showing himself as a 19th century white man,
Yes.
even though he was doing something and abhorred slavery, and there was slavery of the Indians out there too, but the Native Americans were a different story even for Abraham Lincoln, perhaps because of his grandfather being killed by one, and he was named after him. Perhaps he almost didn't exist because his father as a young boy was almost killed in the same raid. We wouldn't have had Abraham Lincoln. And Salmon P. Chase as president, maybe? Oh, my God.
Oh, wow.
But nonetheless,
Yeah.
this is how Lincoln saw them, and and he was in the Black Hawk War, fighting mosquitoes in
Yeah,
1832. But one of the reasons Black Hawk and the Saukees and Fox Indians were pushed out were lead mines, minerals.
Yep.
The Anglos wanted minerals.
Yes.
No different than what seems to be happening right here. And Lincoln was okay with that too.
Yeah,
and what was happening. So I want to ask you then about hard war.
Yeah.
What was the modus operandi for that?
Sure. Well, I mean, if we want to go back to Lincoln's views here, I mean, I think you're exactly right. He was articulating the views of pretty much every white American, whether they were Republicans or Democrats or Northerners and Southerners, Westerners during this period, about Native peoples, about what constituted their difference. And, as that quote shows, that's a very self-serving kind of speech that he made.
But just what you're talking in the book, trying to bring prosperity and civilization out there.
Yes, exactly. And so for Lincoln, I think his view and the view of the Union in general was this kind of competing vision of the future with the Confederacy. He wanted an empire of free labor, right? He wanted people who, white men and women mostly, and then also black men and women, as a result of the Homestead Act, who would then go out and claim land, farm it, maybe go out as miners, strike gold, strike silver or copper, and really make, as he said in 1865, the United States the treasury of the world. And so I think that explains a lot of his support for the Homestead Act, Pacific Railway Act. It also explains why he would support and sign off on the Union Army's campaigns against the Chiricahuas and the Navajos during this period. There had already been gold strikes in Arizona, and so it was in Lincoln's interest and in the Republican Party's interest and the Union's interest to get miners out there to start digging and to get those minerals out of the earth. And in order to do that, they had to defeat or remove native peoples. And so this really explains that whole approach and the fact that James Carleton, who was now in command, was able to, with a pretty free hand, to direct those campaigns. And for Carleton, hard war was an inextricable element of those campaigns. Like, he basically, in his orders to Joseph Rodman West, who was going after Chiricahua Apaches, and to Kit Carson, who was a protagonist in the book and was going after Navajos and Mescalero Apaches, he is very clear about what they are supposed to do. They are to bring the fight to men, if possible, and to imprison the women and children. But one of the things they most certainly needed to do was to destroy croplands, because, and this is the fallacy of what Lincoln says, the Chiricahua Apaches not so much, but Navajos were farmers. They were agriculturalists. They grew all manner of crops. They grew pumpkins and melons and corn was a very important part of their, not only their diet, but also their culture. And so they were farmers, but Carleton didn't care about that. What he wanted, though, was to destroy those fields in the fall of 1863 and to destroy the Navajo hogans, which were their winter shelters. And by doing so, he was actually initiating a hard war in order to force Navajos to surrender, because they would not be able to feed themselves or shelter themselves in the winter to come.
It's interesting going back. This is my area. I have a huge collection on the Black Hawk War of 1832. And it's interesting there. The Sauk and Fox Indians were pretty settled. They had the largest Indian village, settled Indian village in the country at that time. And they were lead miners. So they were sitting there. They weren't, okay, they had a lot to do with the Sioux. They were not happy with each other. There was that. But they were more settled, but still, that didn't matter.
Right.
Nor with the Navajo. That didn't matter.
Right.
Anglos needed that material. So that was the
Right.
hard war. And a fascinating thing. Did the Sioux uprising in Minnesota during the war affect how the Army was battling the Indians in the Southwest, or was it just one of the same?
So that, the Dakota War happens in August and September of 1862, and that's exactly when James Carleton is arriving with 2,000 soldiers of the California Column. And they've been marching from Los Angeles. They were hoping to make it to the Rio Grande in order to help Canby with the Confederates, but they arrived a little too late for that. But then Carleton took over in September of 1862, and they had heard about it. It was reported in the local newspapers, the Dakota War. And that informed Carleton's thinking that he needed to act not only to secure New Mexico for the Union, like fully against the new enemy, native enemy, but he also needed to remove native peoples to reservations where they could be controlled and surveilled so that they could not rise up, they could not make a common alliance, perhaps with the Kiowa and Comanche, perhaps with the Cheyenne Arapaho, that they could not all, because that would be a real problem. Carleton was fairly sure that with the number of men that he had, which was around, again, 3,000, he still had men, they had 2 years left on their enlistments, and so he was using them in these campaigns and to help garrison forts, to have U.S. Army presence all throughout the Southwest. But his problem would be that if Native peoples actually combined together, they would be a very formidable foe, and they would outnumber U.S. soldiers in the region, although this was the largest number of soldiers that had ever been in the Southwest. So I think he had it in his mind. He knew that it had happened. And that was kind of the specter almost. Like he did not want that kind of war evolving in New Mexico. And so he immediately put plans into place to start these campaigns to prevent that from happening.
Just because I want to tell the story, I once had a little Demitasse spoon from the mid-19th century, and engraved in the cup of the spoon was the Sioux 27, 28 being hanged in that square that they put on, 38, all together. And it was engraved in there. And I just kept thinking about some old lady in the Victoriana. Oh, how terrible. Oh, but they deserved it. You know, I can see that happening. But wow, that was how Anglos looked at the Native Americans.
That they would want a souvenir from that.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So I want to go back to, you highlight, as you started, two women, especially in this book.
Yes.
Juanita is one, and the other is, and you talked a little bit about her, and there's so much. I think, 3 chapters are named after her?
Yes.
So I can't say go to the Juanita chapter.
Yeah.
But Louisa Canby.
Yes.
Edward Richard Canby's wife.
Yes.
Was a fascinating woman.
Yes.
And boy, did she do things out there, and became a little controversial. At one point, give us a quick snapshot of her, and also why, as it was written in your book, she was treacherous in revealing supplies set aside for Navajo Indians, unquote.
Yes. So Louisa Canby was so fascinating. I knew I wanted to write about her from the very beginning. I had run into her in Histories of the War, and she struck me as just a really kind of fascinating person. She had met Richard Canby when in the 1830s in Indiana. They were both from there, and she was a college graduate. She went to school in Kentucky, and a lot of her family, actually, 2 of her sisters married Speeds. So this is partly why we know a bit about her, is because their records had been saved because they're related to the Speed family, which becomes prominent with their relationship to Lincoln. So so they're writing her letters when she is away in these forts. But she is what we would think of now as an army wife, right? They got married and almost immediately moved to Florida together. While Richard Canby became an officer in the Army fighting Seminoles in the Second Seminole War. And the only place she went with him to Army forts across the West throughout the 40s and 50s. The only place she didn't go was Mexico with him to fight in the Mexican-American War. And she, in these locations, she was prominent because she was an officer's wife. She also became well known because she, like most 19th century women, became a nurse to many of her own family members, and then also to soldiers at the fort. And so they actually thought of her as a kind of mother figure. And she ends up in Santa Fe. Her husband takes off and goes down to Fort Craig to command the soldiers there. And she is alone in Santa Fe, and she is still alone in Santa Fe when the Confederates come. When the brigands come to town and take it over, she's there because the Union Army has abandoned Santa Fe and decamped and gone to Fort Union, which is about 80 miles further northeast on the Santa Fe Trail. And so she really kind of marshals all the women in the town, kind of acts as their spokesperson. She meets with Sibley when he comes to town, and she had known him before because he had been in Taos when they were posted in Santa Fe in 1860. And she ends up collecting bandages, making food. She knows there's going to be a big battle between Santa Fe and Fort Union, and she wants to be ready for it. And when the Confederates come streaming back into town after the loss of their wagon train at Glorieta, she basically leads this effort to nurse the Confederate wounded. And because of that, they refer to her as the Angel of Santa Fe. They issue a lot of sort of what we would call press releases, lauding her. And this is how I knew about her, because the interesting thing about her is I only have seen one letter in her own handwriting, and it's from later in the war in 1864 from Louisiana. And she kept no diary. There are no letters from this period. And so all I knew about her was what other people had said about her. So, but
They spoke a lot about her.
they spoke a lot about her. John Clark knew her very well. There are a lot of diary entries where she is included. So I knew, but again, I knew where she was because she was married to Richard Canby. I knew exactly where she was in all of these situations. And then all of these other people kind of attested to her activities, which also included revealing that the Indian Agency had all of these blankets and shirts and implements for that were supposed to go to the Navajos, but had been there because of the outbreak of the war itself, and she led the Confederates to those, and they took them for themselves.
I've been remiss in not letting a couple of questions come in from you people, even though I've asked for them. So I'm going to ask one here that's fascinating. Tom,
Yes.
via the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop website.
Okay.
You can be on Facebook as live as well, but
Okay.
he's on our website, Tom. We don't know where you're from. You're from USA, I hope.
Okay.
How did Lincoln rationalize the execution of 38 natives in December of '62? What was its impact on the Civil War in the West? Great interview. Thanks for your perseverance. Thank you for the kind words. But was there impact then? We talked a bit about it.
Yeah, so that's a great question, Tom. And there are a lot of historians actually who are now working on the Dakota War. And so there are going to be books out very soon that will give you the whole picture of this. But from what I can tell just from reading the documents and reading the histories that we do have, there were actually more than 400 Dakota men who were imprisoned and who the army out there wanted to execute as traitors, which is interesting. That's a whole different, like, who is treasonous, right? So Lincoln wanted to see the documentation himself. As a former lawyer, he wanted to, this is a very highly unusual situation, and he wanted to make sure that if the U.S. Army was going to execute enemy combatants, that there would be good reason for it. And so he actually went through all of the documentation, and he ended up releasing all but the 38, where there had been proof that they had murdered men and or raped women. And so he rationalized, I think, those executions because of the nature of those crimes. He also, I think, really needed to keep white Minnesotans on the side of the Union, and he wanted to keep them. There was a real danger that if there was no kind of punishment from the federal government in the form of an execution, that white Minnesotans would rise up and he'd have another issue, domestic issue on his hands. So those are kind of the two reasons why at the moment, but I think, again, a lot of this future work is going to give us a lot of really good details about that.
Interesting. So here is one from Joe in Stillwater, Oklahoma. Thank you, Joe. I hope this isn't off topic. We didn't get to it, that's all. But how did disease and the fear of disease affect this history in brief, please?
A question for our time.
Because you're gonna, exactly it.
Yes.
Because here we are.
Yes. So for the Confederates, there was actually a smallpox outbreak within the Sibley campaign pretty early. And this is what always happens, right? And this is why there are all these arguments for social distancing right now and the cancellation of these group events, because what you have, and this is the case in every army in the Civil War, and I think this is one of the ways in which this theater is actually very much like other theaters in the war, is that when you bring thousands of people together who have not been proximate before, you create a disease community and disease transmission that's very rapid and often fatal. So there was a smallpox outbreak in the Confederate Army. Also, when the Navajos got to Bosque Redondo, there were many more people than Carleton had sort of assumed who had surrendered to the army. So there were between 8,000 and 10,000 people who now had to be sheltered, and there were no provisions for them. This is part of the disaster of the reservation of Bosque Redondo. And so you had thousands of people living in close proximity, which they never had before, because the Navajo homeland is very large. And what most bands did to survive was to scatter, so that they could manage natural resources, and that really helped them. And it also helped them not to catch these terrible diseases. And so when they went to Bosque Redondo, they were living much more closely together. There were not enough trees for them to build hogans for themselves. So they were basically living in dirt huts that actually, if you look at the photographs, they look very much like Andersonville. So when we think about Bosque Redondo, I think there are ways we can think about it as a prison camp akin to Andersonville. And so just as in Andersonville, you have people who are succumbing to disease because of exposure, because of bad food, their weakened immune systems. So that's really where we see, in two different ways, sort of within the Army itself and then within a civilian population, disease really working to shape that Civil War experience.
Well, there is so much in this book. And if you think you're enjoying this interview, wait till you get to the book. Because truly, it just flows, wonderful narrative, and fascinating people that we really didn't know about, most of us. Some of you maybe have, but most of us not. So we're getting now at the end of our time together.
It's gone by
It
so
goes just like
fast.
that.
It's gone by so fast.
But there are upcoming broadcasts on House Divided, but the one that we have next ain't going to happen.
Oh.
The Volia Glimpse with her women's fight, a wonderful war, is now postponed, we hope. Watch our website for recycling. Duke University is not allowing anyone from there to travel, and it's, again, good practices. So she won't be here with us. I do recommend her book, and hopefully we'll be able to reschedule it. But please watch for other shows that we have coming. We have 3 of them right now in April, knock on wood. Now, if you're watching this on YouTube and you still want one of these books, a signed first edition, we've got them while we have them. So please order them, and we'll get them to you through the mails. That's still going on, and you'll have something to do the next 2-3 weeks while you're sitting there self-quarantine. Now, look, there's so much we didn't get to in here. I'm just going to mention, we talked about Magnus Coloradus, but he's throughout this book and a fascinating character. Henry Sibley, many of you know Sibley and his brigade. He's involved in this and in detail. Kit Carson, for heaven's sakes. He impacted this story in a number of places. So you know about him. Really how the wars in the West shaped each other, Independence, Missouri, and how that was the gateway to the Santa Fe Trail and what that was like at the beginning of this book and later. We talked a little bit about the battles. They're there in enough military history for anyone to enjoy. It's interesting what you said about Glorieta Pass, that lives that have been lost in the effort to conquer New Mexico have been wasted. As who was it who said, we had lost the victory? And that happened right there, right in the middle of your book.
Yes.
That takes place. So you have to get to read it. We're not going to tell you everything. You've got to read this book, for heaven's sakes. The Cut Tent was fascinating with Geronimo. Now,
with Cochise.
With Cochise, I'm
Yes.
sorry, you're
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
With Cochise. And many of us know that and how he got out of this tent by cutting through it. And others, his brother, for instance, was arrested and not treated well.
No.
And so you can see where Cochise would not be happy and would be happy to wage war
Absolutely.
on the Anglos coming in. The Long Walk, fascinating, because you probably know about the Trail of Tears. This is the Western Trail of Tears, just as brutal to the Native Americans. And in detail, you tell what that happened from Navajo remembrances. And they all came in thinking they were going to go to a good place, and there they were going to Bosque Redondo, which was their reservation, and how they finally got out of it and actually went back to their native home.
Yes.
Not everyone did.
No.
The
Very
Blackhawks,
rare. Yeah.
Blackhawks, Sauk, and Fox, they never got there.
Nope.
And they're still in reservations in Iowa, and I think actually in Oklahoma too. The slavery of some Indians, that's in this book. And so there was a juxtaposition and irony of the Eastern theater and the Western theater, and that slaves not everywhere are being watched. So many reasons to come back and read this book, and I hope you will. Megan Kate Nelson, thank you so much for being here for really a fascinating book. The Three-Cornered War, the Union, the Confederacy, and Native peoples in the fight for the West. We thank again Scribner for sending you out here.
Yes.
They've always helped us with their authors, and we hope that we do the same for them. So again, thank you so much. I hope you'll be with us again. We have a lot on YouTube, by the way, of our past shows and broadcasts and interviews with major authors in numbers of areas and fields. You have nothing to do for the next 2 or 3 weeks and beyond? Sit and watch our YouTube channel. Go to Abraham Lincoln Bookshop at YouTube and watch to your delight. And sometimes we may even have some books here for sale if you want to get into them and have a signed edition still available. Thanks again for watching. Have a good day.